Welcome, everybody. People are starting to come in. Welcome. It looks like people are still arriving. Tammy, do you want to pull the PowerPoint up?
Sure.
I think, why don't we get going? I know that a few more people are going to be joining us today, but why don't we get things started? Welcome everybody to meeting number 4. I'll do a quick overview. Tammy, if you go to the next slide. We want to let everybody know that this session is recorded. Microphones are muted. The ways to engage is to raise your hand or to use chat. There is a closed captioning option on your bar at the bottom of your Zoom meeting that can be used. And we are also going to do breakout rooms today. And of course, as always, if you have additional input, please send Susan an email to share with the stakeholder group. So if there's something that you thought about after the meeting or even during the meeting, something you want to share, please forward that to Susan. Next slide. Chat. It's on the menu bar. It's a little button you click on. The chat bar comes up. You type your message in below where it says everybody and push enter, and we can all see your chat. Next slide. And to raise your hand, you go to reactions, and at the bottom of that bar, you can see a little hand that's up. Next slide. Today, we are going to talk about 2 topics. We're going to talk about planning for safe evacuation and emergency response, as well as development considerations and next steps. Next slide. Susan, is this your slide?
I don't know that we assigned it, but I can sure speak to it, Libby. Yeah, and this slide is really just a reminder of the charge of the stakeholder group, and we really appreciate you all being involved to help provide feedback and have discussions about some of the options that we're exploring for our recommendations for wildfire adapted communities.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. I did also want to also encourage everybody to share their unique experiences and views with the LCD on wildfire mitigation efforts. So we're doing breakout rooms today, hoping to have more opportunities to hear from everybody on this group. Tammy, next slide. All right, welcome and introductions. Susan.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, so good morning. My name is Susan Millhauser, and I'm a natural hazards wildfire planner with Department of Land Conservation and Development, and the staff lead for the Wildfire Adapted Communities Project. And again, we're really happy to have folks here this morning, and really appreciate your participation in the stakeholder group, in addition to many of the other ways you're involved in this work, either in your communities or supporting state efforts with different agencies. So if folks want to take a minute, you're welcome to introduce yourselves by putting your name and affiliation in the chat. And we really are glad to have you here today to share your unique views and ideas. And so now I will turn it over to Sadie to share a land acknowledgement and some other information.
Thank you, Susan. Good morning, everyone. Sadie Carney. I'm the communications manager and a policy analyst for DLCD. And I am, like Susan and others, very grateful that you all are here and helping us in this work. And as we've done before, I'd like to start our meeting with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge the many tribes and bands who call Oregon their ancestral territory and honor the ongoing relationship between the land, plants, animals, and people indigenous to this place we now call Oregon. We recognize the continued sovereignty of the 9 federally recognized tribes who have ties to this place and thank them for continuing to teach us how we might all be here together. Thank you. So just to ground us in the conversation, I wanted to review briefly DLCD's charge under Senate Bill 762 in Section 11, which is the land use section. We are to identify recommended changes. So recommendations are not rules. They may at some point become rules or guidelines or planning assistance for local communities. But at this point, we're not there. We are making broad recommendations to the legislature and the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council on ways that we can use land use tools and some similar or close to land use tools, what looks to a consumer like land use tools, to help adapt our communities to wildfire risk. So this includes the statewide land use planning program, local comprehensive plans, zoning codes, all that incorporate an incorporation of the wildfire risk map to minimize wildfire risk in our communities, including appropriate levels of state and local resources necessary for effective implementation. So when we say state and local resources, we're talking about money, we're talking about tools, and we're talking about people. And then this language is from the bill. Recommended changes may include, but need not be limited to, provisions regarding sufficient defensible space, building codes, safe evacuation, which we'll talk about today, and development considerations in areas of extreme and high wildfire risk, allowing for regional differences. So those last 2 pieces, evacuation and development considerations, are the bulk of our topics for today. And we can go to the next slide. So the path that we will be following really ends at the top 2 check marks for this phase of the work. So we are required to respond to Senate Bill 762 with a report, including our recommendations that you're helping us develop by October 1st, 2022. Far away, but not that far away. And our recommendations will also be considered by the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council. And then what happens after that, the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council, in addition to DLCD, will advance recommendations on future work related to wildfire adaptation to the legislature. And in the 2023 long session, which starts in January, the legislature may advance legislation related to this work, may enact some or a portion of the recommendations that they have gotten from the advisory council from DLCD. They may take their own path. Those that have worked with the legislature know that that is possible. And then finally, any legislation that does advance through the session and is passed into law could direct DLCD to adopt rules related to wildfire. And that would be followed by a rulemaking process, which is similar to what we're doing now, but a lot more detailed, and would likely be a longer and much more involved process. But again, broad community engagement, and really looking at the ways that we implement the recommendations versus developing kind of broad recommendations themselves. So much more detailed work. All right, and then next slide. So before we move into the subject matter, I wanted to take this group back, and I think many of you did participate in our community listening sessions. Thank you very much for that. Those were fantastic conversations. And one of the things that we heard loud and clear in our community listening sessions, and that we have heard with this group, is the need for our recommendations and our work moving forward in this space to really consider equity. So language accessibility is, let me find my notes on this slide, sorry. Language accessibility is something that we have heard many times. And it's a challenge at all stages. It's a challenge in getting the information to people today. It is a challenge in evacuation scenarios. It is a challenge in recovery scenarios. And so we are looking closely at that as we're responding to what we heard in these community listening sessions. And we're eager to hear from you if you have additional ideas about how we could consider or incorporate equity recommendations into this work or our report that we advance. And then a one-size-fits-all approach will not work. And I think that's really, that speaks to the previous bullet and previous idea, but it also speaks to the varying needs that we have across the state, the differences between very urbanized communities and very rural communities, the difference between people that are desk jockeys like myself and people that are farmers and working on the ground, or as a colleague of mine calls it, the carpet and concrete conflict, right? So one size fits all does not work for everybody and will not work in this scenario. So how do we incorporate those differences with equity in mind, but also with kind of the, like all versions of equity, if you will. So it's not just about differing communities, but differing populations, different industries, different communities, rural and urban. Statewide planning efforts need to be flexible for local communities. That's a lot of what is built into our land use system today, and should balance the needs of individuals and the community. So how do we provide appropriate levels of autonomous decision-making for landowners, homeowners, renters, developers? And how do we take the broad needs of a community into consideration with those concerns in mind? And then finally, one thing we heard in our community listening sessions is that there's a real benefit in having a consistent system that can apply throughout the state, but there's a tension there, because when we say a one-size-fits-all approach will not work, or when we hear that a one-size-fits-all approach will not work, and then we also hear there is a benefit in consistent application, and that helps planners and communities and builders and developers, where do we find the middle ground? So those are some of the questions that we're asking you to help us answer. And I'm really excited for the conversation that we have coming up. We have one of our staff experts on transportation here to talk to us about transportation planning at a local level. So I am going to mute myself and turn over the platform.
Thanks, Sadie. I'll just take a second and introduce Laura Buell, who's a transportation and land use planner with DLCD. And Laura joined us at our last meeting, and we ran out of time because we were having such great conversation with our other guest speakers last time as well. And Laura's going to provide some information about the transportation planning rule that may help inform our discussions around evacuation, emergency response, and how people can get in and out of properties. So thanks for being here, Laura. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so my slides are in there. Who's controlling the slides? Oh, yeah, Tammy. Okay, thank you. I don't know. Are these, did my animations come through or?
Yes, they did. So
okay, so I'll just say next every time you click.
That sounds great.
You need to click. Okay, great. So I was at this last meeting and I decided to go over some of the things I covered before, just to remind people. This time I have slides, so those of you who are visual learners can benefit from that. But I wanted to begin just by saying that evacuation related to natural hazards is not mentioned in the transportation planning rule, which is what we call Division 12 of the Oregon Administrative Rules. Emergency vehicle access is mentioned a few times, but not specifically evacuation. Nonetheless, I haven't identified anything that would constitute a barrier to communities, including considerations for evacuation in their transportation system plans. And there are also quite a number of provisions that support this without expressly saying so. So if you think a couple steps ahead, you can tell how a certain provision for planning would support evacuation. There is one provision that could be strengthened, and that's connectivity, which is it's stated that it must be addressed in creating standards for local streets. And connectivity is crucial to evacuation because it provides options and increases the capacity of the whole system instead of shunting everybody onto the same street. But the language around that is somewhat weak. It falls short of a strong requirement. Next.
Laura,
Okay, next.
I don't mean
Yes.
to interrupt you. I just want to make sure it's okay for people to know that if they have questions during your presentation, to just put their hands up during your presentation. as well.
Yes, so I'll try to,
We'll keep our eye out too.
yeah, okay, perfect. Next. Okay, so the TPR, I'm going to go through some of the elements of the TPR purpose. This is a selection. I didn't do the entire list because that would mean reading the rule, which nobody wants me to do, but I selected out some of the highlights. So the transportation planning rule is intended to direct coordinated land use and transportation planning. That's really important. There's a lot of land use in this transportation planning rule. Next. It's also written to encourage and support a variety of transportation choices, including walking, biking, and transit, and avoiding reliance on any one mode of transportation. Next. It also ensures coordination among, I'm not sure what the TRP is. Oh, TPR is Transportation Planning Rule. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. Ensure coordination among local governments and transportation services, and consistency among local, regional, and state transportation plans. I'll talk a little bit more about those plans in a second. Next. And make sure that changes to comprehensive plans, so that's land use primarily, are supported by adequate transportation facilities. So this is a recurring theme, that land use and transportation planning have to happen in a coordinated manner. Next. And again. And then another goal is to make efficient use of the transportation system that we already have. So there are a lot of provisions around being more efficient in our transportation. Next. And then the transportation planning rule, by coordinating land use and transportation planning, we can meet other state and local objectives, including, and this is a direct quote, containing urban development, reducing cost of public services, protecting farm and forest land, reducing air, water, and noise pollution, conserving energy, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So by carrying out the TPR, we can achieve all of these objectives. Next. Okay, so there are two phases of transportation planning. The first is transportation system planning. So those are the TSPs. And then transportation project development, which I'm not going to talk about because that's essentially building out what's in the TSP. And TSPs, there's several different levels of TSPs. There's a state TSP, which ODOT does. Then there are regional TSPs, also called regional transportation plans, and they're done by the metropolitan planning organizations, otherwise known as NPOs. And there are 8 of those in Oregon: the Rogue Valley, the Middle Rogue, Bend, Eugene, Springfield, Corvallis, Albany. They're not joined, they're separate. Salem Kaiser, which is joined, and Portland Metro. Milton Freewater is part of the Walla Walla Valley MPO, so that isn't an MPO but not affected by these rules. And then counties will do some transportation. MPOs do transportation planning for major regional facilities, and counties will do planning for areas outside those facilities. And then cities and counties both do local transportation system plans. Next. So, and one more. Okay, so elements. First, determination of transportation needs. And these needs must or may, and I'll tell you why I include both those words, be met by land use measures. So Metro must provide measures, land use measures, to meet transportation needs. All other jurisdictions may. And what do we mean by land use measures to achieve transportation needs? Those are things like mixed use, pedestrian and cycle and transit-friendly development, increasing residential uses and densities near jobs and services, having more commercial uses near or in residential areas, and having a better jobs housing balance. The rule actually has a list of the types of land use measures that could meet transportation needs. So really it's about reducing demand for transportation and thereby reducing pressure on our transportation system. Next. Okay, they must include a road plan, and here connections are key. This will include a layout of local streets, and that layout must provide for safe and convenient bike and pedestrian travel. It includes extensions of existing streets, connections to existing and planned streets, and connections to neighborhood destinations. So you can see connections, that's a recurring theme. Also access management. And what is access management? Access management are measures that regulate access to streets, roads, and highways from public roads and from private driveways. So some examples of what access management is: restricting where interchanges can be, restricting how often driveways can be built, regulating the distance between intersections, those types of things to so that you don't end up with a driveway every 10 feet and cars trying to come in and out onto the roadway. Okay, next. And it must include a public transportation plan. Next. A bike ped plan. Next. Yep. And there are also provisions for cities that are over 25,000 people. There has to be transportation system management. So those are methods to get more out of the existing transportation system. And then transportation demand management. And those are measures taken to reduce demand for transportation. So it could be pricing or carpooling or incentivizing non-automobile travel, and also some of the land use measures that were mentioned before. Next. The parking plan, MPOs have to have this. Next.
Hey, Laura.
Oh, Sadie, yes.
Thanks, Laura. Just want to ask a quick question for clarification. transportation demand management is really, it's primarily focused on reducing the demand for single occupancy vehicles, right?
Correct.
Not transportation overall. Okay.
No, but right, for single occupancy vehicles, that's really the focus. But typically when you reduce the demand for that, it's just there's less transportation needed. So if you live a 3-minute walk from your job, you're transporting yourself much less than if you live a 30-minute drive from your job. Mary Kyle?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Sadie for making that clarification, because transportation isn't just the car. It's walking, bicycling, bus, carpooling, a variety of other things. So I view it as providing options so that we're not primarily reliant, as the transportation planning rule says, reducing primary reliance on a single occupancy vehicle, but it could still be in a car, it could be carpooling. But walking is transportation. And so it's providing networks to be able to do that, or to bicycle, that sort of thing. So
Yes,
the
no,
transportation planning
absolutely.
rule encompasses all of that. So I had some also issues with like the language that we were using.
Yeah, well, that's the language in the rule. And
Yeah, but it talks about multimodal transportation. So I think we need to make sure that
it does, but this particular plan is called the Transportation Demand Management Plan, and that is in the rule. And that's what
right.
these types of plans are called that. And
I
as I
understand.
said, if you have less to travel, so if you reduce your distance of travel, then a lot of other modes become feasible that weren't feasible before.
Right. I get that. It's just, I don't want to eliminate all these other ways that people get around, because
no, believe me, my colleagues will tell you that I'm quite passionate about that.
Right.
As well.
And I know it's just
Clarification.
yeah, it's a clarification. It's not, you're not just talking about cars here, because a quarter of the population and growing doesn't drive. They have to get around. They do transport in other ways.
Great. Okay. So any other questions? Okay, then cities, let's say MPOs have to do a parking plan, and any city over 2,500 has to do a financing plan. Next slide. Oh, and then this is a good segue into our next section. Another element is policies and land use regulations for implementing the TSP. So next. Yes, and this is a quote: each local government shall amend its land use regulations to implement the TSP. So you can see that the focus in transportation planning is really land use. Next. So there needs to be, and just as a note, these are selected implementation measures. In the actual rule, there are more implementation measures. What I did was select out the ones that I thought were relevant to this conversation. So if you're interested in reading all of them, that is in section 66-012-0045 of the Oregon Administrative Rules, if you want to read them all. If not, here's the selection. So access control, which I already talked about, that's driveway, public road spacing. And also, and this is key, limiting development on rural lands to rural uses and densities. So not overdeveloping areas that are not equipped to handle more development. Next. And including standards to protect future operation of roads and transit corridors. Next. A process for coordinated review of future land use decisions affecting transportation facilities. So there needs to be a way to review how future development will impact transportation. Next. And then also a process to apply conditions to development proposals to minimize transportation impacts. And those can be things like the land use measures that I mentioned earlier, ensuring that there's mixed use, ensuring that jobs and residential uses are in close proximity. So it's easier to have mode choice when that occurs, as well as opportunities for commerce close to where people live, walking distance. Next. And then direct routes for pedestrians and cyclists. This is specifically mentioned as direct routes for pedestrians and cyclists. It does not talk about direct routes for automobiles. And this includes allowing cul-de-sacs. Cul-de-sacs are and dead-end streets are specifically allowed, but they would need to have bike and pedestrian access ways. So at the end of a cul-de-sac, you could cut through if you are on a bike or pedestrian. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this is the one element that, while it is beneficial certainly for pedestrians and cyclists, if we're looking at automobile evacuation, cul-de-sacs and dead ends, of course, could be a problem. Next. Okay, sorry, that was my last slide. I was going to say also that there are provisions for transportation improvements on rural lands, including transportation improvements that are allowed without a goal exception, and then transportation improvements that require a goal exception. And I wasn't sure, Susan or Sadie, if that's part of the conversation here, if you wanted to talk about that at all, or focus on what I've just presented.
You know, Laura, if you would want to just talk about that for a minute, because that our next slide, you know, we go to what we heard at some of our community listening sessions, and folks did bring that up in terms of streamlining improvements for rural roads. So if you want to speak to that briefly, that would be great.
Yeah, so there are a number of improvements that are allowed without any goal exception in rural areas, and some are accessory transportation improvements for uses that are already allowed in a rural area. So, you know, a road to access your farm or something like that. Sadie?
Could you talk just briefly and help people understand why a county would need a goal exception? I'm not sure that everybody that's in this meeting is kind of familiar enough with the process to understand what that is and why it would be needed.
So I'm not for a transportation improvement.
Yeah, you were talking about how, oh, John maybe has an answer for us. Yes.
Oh yeah, I think John would probably be a much better person to answer this question. Thank you.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us this morning. I'm rarely the better person to answer any question. I'm not sure that I'm here either. But so I think this goes back. This is where and it's complicated, right? We're talking about the intersection of several rules and several provisions for the protection of, you know, multiple resources, specifically farmland and forest land. We have uses that can be allowed that are listed in statute and rule. Some of those include transportation uses, but there are transportation activities that are, you know, that are envisioned or desired that fall outside of what may be allowed. You know, so if it's something that would be more than, you know, serving local levels of traffic, or something more than a footpath or a bike path, or an improvement in an existing right of way, it might require a higher level of review. It's not to say it's a bad thing, but it could require a higher level of review. In fact, when LCDC adopted the temporary rules in response to the 2020 wildfires, we wrote in a provision to make sure that a road could be developed in the event a particular property was necessary to be utilized for temporary sheltering. So I think how I would characterize this piece, and I see Sam has something to say here too, is I think we want to look at it, and if we don't believe that there is a straightforward enough pathway for transportation facilities that we believe could be important and necessary, then we may want to reconsider what the best pathway is, whether that's a conditional use proceeding or something else. So I don't know if that gets to the question squarely enough or not, but the bottom line is that there are uses that can be allowed in exclusive farm use zone, forest zone. That's most of the state. I mean, most of the state is in those two zoning categories. A used transportation route that falls outside of what the legislature or LCDs have determined requires higher level of scrutiny. It can happen,
I think,
but they require a higher level of scrutiny.
I think
Yeah,
we
I
can
just, go ahead.
I was just gonna go to the next slide because I do think it's interesting what Sadie was saying, that some of this came up from our community listening sessions.
Okay, well,
yeah.
just to break it down, the rule in subsection 0065 has a list of all the transportation improvements that are considered consistent with goals 3, 4, 11, and 14. And somebody else will need to rattle off which goals those are because I can't remember them off the top of my head.
Okay.
But that are consistent with those goals and do not need a goal exception. Anything that's not on that list would require a goal exception. So I don't know all the circumstances. I don't work in rural areas, so I can't off the top of my head think of all the circumstances that would need a goal exception. But anything that's on this list in the rule doesn't need a goal exception.
Right.
So some examples of that are improvements that are accessory to a use that's allowed on the land, like I just mentioned, a road to your farm or something. There are
Or-
yeah.
You put a link in the chat to that, to what you were reading.
You know what, Sadie included a link to the
Okay.
whole Division
Okay.
12. And Laura, I
Okay.
think
Yeah.
we're running short on time.
Okay,
so
great. Well then,
But
I
thank
will
you.
leave it at that.
Very
Thank you.
informative presentation. Are there any other questions for Laura? Nope. It looks like you covered it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So Laura, if you're able, if you have a few minutes to stick around, we are going to talk a little more. So what I wanted to go over, and you can see the slide here, we have a couple slides about what we heard from the community listening sessions. We held 4 sessions. They were virtual. We had folks from around the state join us. There is on our website, and I have shared this link with you all, but a summary of all of the 4 sessions and the comments we received. If folks want to go back and look at that link to our website. But here, are some of the considerations we heard related to transportation, evacuation, and access. Certainly evacuation route planning and warning systems really need to look carefully at the characteristics of the community and its members. And here are some examples, in areas of the state where there's one-way roads, there's, folks who don't have their own transportation, other health and physical limitations, livestock and pet evacuation came up, and certainly we language barriers in terms of communicating with folks during that emergency situation. It also was brought up that rural roads really do have limitations for serving as evacuation routes. So there's that balance of, most of the time they meet the need. Other times, what are some ways that there could potentially be improvements? And then there were also conversations around some of the best practices, really recommend, additional access and exiting from a property to enhance, emergency responders coming in and people and animals getting out. So if codes were to address, is there some type of threshold? What size property? And, I don't want to get into the weeds there, but thinking about that. But then there are also concerns about, well, gosh, if you're requiring a second egress from a property, that might eliminate some properties from being buildable. So there really are, each property has its own unique characteristics. So there's a need for a balance there. Next slide, please. Some of the solutions we heard from people in the community listening sessions were, there was a lot of conversation around evacuation route signage, which we heard from our guests from Ashland, last time was, they're reconsidering signage. So this is really an evolving practice, because depending where the fire is coming from and where people need to go, but there may be some opportunities, for dead end streets or for areas where folks aren't familiar with the lay of the land, to get them towards the main roads and not away from them. There were also, this is the example I raised earlier, a suggestion that maybe there are streamlined land use exception process for evacuation improvements for rural roadways for new and existing development. And then also redevelopment opportunities with recommendations for shared access agreement. To
Susan,
provide access.
You have a
Yes.
question in the chat from Kurt.
I see that. Thank you. Kurt, that is a great question. And, this is, the question is, is there a proposal to require a second access road to residential properties? And I think broadly speaking, that definitely has been raised. I think there are questions about, again, the size of the property, what type of development, if it's a single family home, maybe that doesn't make sense, right? And you have a small lot, but if there is a larger development or an example that was shared with me was a property, and I'm going to get this wrong, and all you folks up in the McKenzie, please correct me, that the basketball academy site, Patrick, our regional rep, was talking about, like, there's folks looking to redevelop that property, but there's only one road in and out. But maybe there's an opportunity, and we were talking very theoretically months ago, but the property next to it has access, and maybe there's an opportunity for shared access for folks, to be able to redevelop that lot, but also meet some safety needs. Next question, next slide. So as we're getting ready to go in our breakout rooms, these are some concepts that we are exploring based on feedback from you all, from our community listening sessions, also based in some of the best practices that we've shared with the committee or with the stakeholder group and in our research more broadly. And some of these things are already happening in some parts of the state, like in our forest zones. But again, you can see we're talking about considering multiple access points, potentially multiple driveways or shared driveways for larger developments or multifamily developments, looking at things like driveway widths, lengths, and pullouts and slopes, adequate for firefighting apparatus, and those types of standards are actually already in our forest zones. So can the fire truck get into your property? Can they pass each other on the road? Are there pullouts? And I see your question, Sam, so I will address that. Street width and gradients for new development in rural areas. And I bolded rural because we really are thinking about areas where there is limited capacity, there's limited connectivity in rural areas. The space between, or the distance between crossroads, are much more long versus in a more urban or suburban area where we ideally will have more of a connected network. Chad.
Yeah, I just wanted to provide a little context for the group as it relates to driveway widths, lengths, pullouts. There's already, fire code requirements statutorily that the State Fire Marshal's Office adopts in the Oregon Fire Code as it relates to access and water supply. So I would just make sure that we're consistent with current code language, and that that already exists in code for new development and things along those lines, working with land use planners and whatnot. Just wanted to provide that.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Chad. And Chad and I have talked about this quite a bit. there may be in the future enhanced standards for areas that are in the WUI and extreme and high hazard areas, that might make sense, that are not being addressed in the Office of State Fire Marshal's Defensible Space Code, but they are in, as Chad mentioned, the Oregon Fire Code. And so, there may be an opportunity in the future to look at, are there additional standards that might make sense in these more high-risk areas? Laura.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that related to this, one of the uses that is allowed without a goal exception is new access roads and collectors that are built or that are in built or committed exception areas. And exception areas are areas that have been given an exception to one of Oregon's goals, and they tend to be kind of those areas in the WUI, actually. They tend to be built up areas around cities. Those tend to be where exception areas are found, although it's not a rule. Or in other areas, meaning not exception areas, where the function of the road is to reduce local access to or local traffic on a state highway. And these roads are limited to 2 travel lanes, and they're limited to rural needs or to provide adequate emergency access. So that seemed to be pretty relevant to evacuation needs potentially, and that is allowed without a goal exception.
Great, thanks,
I
Laura.
want to note, Sadie, I know you have your hand up, but I just see some questions in the chat for Chad, and I just want to make sure he saw them.
Yeah, I do see that. I just wanted to piggyback briefly on Chad's earlier sort of statement of reassurance that some of this stuff is already things that we are considering in order to meet our state fire code. And just remind folks that really, when we're talking about community planning or local government planning, we're talking about coordination at a local level. So coordinating with fire departments, the Oregon State Fire Marshal has a minimum code, but local governments could be more specific, they could be more stringent, and they could make those decisions based on conversations with their local firefighting authority. And so that could take into consideration the capacity of the firefighting entity, the equipment needs, other pieces of knowledge that would come into play at a very local and personal level, but not necessarily be captured in a statewide code. So I think the idea is, do we want to encourage this kind of coordination with a local firefighting entity in a way that could honor what they see as their capacity, ability, equipment needs, etc.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for posting that link, Kelly. How about Samantha? I saw your question for Chad. I'm gonna just walk through the last couple of bullets here, since that's a little off topic of what we're talking about, and then we could address that real quickly. So some other things that have come up, and this we're talking, Sadie, thank you for clarifying. We're talking about local coordination with fire departments, which is already happening. Certainly when someone comes to the planning or building counter, the fire department is involved in reviewing development applications. And so we're just talking about additional opportunities that may exist in areas, where there's higher risk. Some of the other things that maybe this is a little beyond local coordination, but it's more, maybe a county talking with public land owners like the Forest Service or BLM or state parks, but are there opportunities to identify and manage rural routes for evacuation purposes? So are there roads through, Forest Service that are locked that maybe with pre-planning and conversation, those could be opened and people could evacuate? And then a couple more things, a little more nuts and bolts, and this already happens largely in rural areas, but really street signage and addressing, being visible from the roadway. So our first responders can, easily identify a property and access it. Again, that's already happening, but it is, best practice that's certainly important. And then the last thing I'll mention, in reviewing literature, there are potentially opportunities to identify temporary safe zones. And so this might be an area along an evacuation route where there are some pullouts or places where someone with a horse trailer or something could stop and get organized, or where people, if they can't leave one way, but they could gather in another area until like a road is opened to leave a zone. There are standards for what those temporary safe zones might look like in terms of defensible space and size, and community can be thinking about that with their first responders and fire departments and emergency managers. Like, where are some places in our county or in our area that might make sense to identify as temporary safe zones, and working with the planners to identify appropriate sites. And then lastly, I mentioned evacuation signage, and that's something that has some important use, but is also being looked at in different ways. And then there's some other considerations that we can talk about in our breakout rooms. And so now look back in the chat. So Chad, looks like you get to answer a couple questions if you don't mind. So I don't know, I can, if you want to just look at the chat, or I can read them out to you. It's up to you.
It's like,
Yeah, I'm trying to catch up. I apologize. I think I opened Pandora's box, and I apologize to DLCD for doing that. Sadie, Susan, my apologies.
No problem.
But yes, looking at a couple questions, we're talking about multiple access points that does already exist. And I think what's highlighted here is when we talk access and water supply related to the fire department, it is truly fire department access and water supply. Can they get into that residential or commercial occupancy? And then also, do they have the appropriate water supply? And in lieu of that appropriate water supply in those rural areas, what opportunities do we have to make that home successful? So there are options and alternate methods, both on the building code side and the fire code side, that makes us get to a successful point. But one of the questions was multiple access points, and that does already exist. It's over 30 1 to 2 family dwelling units. And again, access and water supply is determined truly at that land use and planning stage. This is not for platted and plotted communities necessarily. So I think that's something important to realize, that it is truly that initial development land use planning phase, and having good relationships with your local BO planning officials and the fire department to determine what those good access and water supply points and parameters will be. But Kelly, I appreciate you posting that our code in the link. That is Appendix D, which talks about actual specifics regarding access, widths, hammerheads, and water supply components. So I'll try to answer the questions in the chat, so I keep you guys on point. But yeah, if anyone has any additional questions, don't hesitate.
thank you. Susan, are we ready to move to the breakout rooms?
Yeah, I just want to make sure.
Oh, Kelly has a hand up.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. So I believe the fire code allows the second access point to be waived if all the dwelling units have a fire suppression system, which might work for putting out fires within the houses, but it does not create an evacuation route for a wildfire incident. So I didn't know if Chad could speak to that just for a minute before we go into breakout rooms.
Susan, Sadie, is that okay?
Yeah, please. This
Okay,
is all for
yeah,
me.
and you're spot on. There are 2 exceptions to the conversation of the 1 and 2 family dwellings, 2 access points. The exceptions are an approved automatic sprinkler system, so a residential sprinkler system essentially being installed throughout the house. And then it talks about the number of dwelling units there that can be worked with the fire official and some of those planning considerations. But to his point, this doesn't look at evacuation route planning, and I want to make that pretty clear too. They are not synonymous with access and water supply. Access and water supply truly looks at getting tillers, large pieces of fire apparatus down roads, making sure grades are appropriate, widths are appropriate, that they can actually get to those places. And again, that water supply component is in there as well. So I just wanted to, great question. There are parameters of the code that gets us some of those, I would call them pieces of egress. But at the same time, it is truly for getting fire department folks in there, both fire side and then also EMS as well. So great point.
Thanks, Chad. And I think there's one last question from Dave, which I think would be helpful for all of us to hear the response. So it was, does OSFM have sufficient authority to regulate road standards for fire safety? So I don't know if that's more around like brush clearing, but also size and design, et cetera.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And Dave and I haven't talked about that specifically, but it is truly, when we look at access and water supply, that's one of those funny things is when you're at the land use and planning stage, that may be 10, 5, 15 years before that community is developed and established. And so, as we know, technology changes, building construction and design changes. So there's not necessarily an opportunity to authority-wise to reevaluate access and water supply at the time of construction, which I think can be nuanced or whatnot. But I believe as far as access and water supply, as long as the fire department, is included, in that access and water supply conversation, that's great. And even once you go to build, just, maybe, touching in, does this still apply? Are we able to make modifications if need be? But when it comes to that time, we probably, in my opinion, probably don't have the authority to reevaluate for some of those access and water supply components. It's truly, again, at that land use and planning stage, which may not be at time of construction. That may be 5, 10, 15 years down the road.
Great, thank you. Sadie.
I just have a quick follow-up for Chad. Sorry, Chad, to put you on the spot here, pull you into this meeting. So when you're talking about water supply, I'm on a municipal water supply, right? But I don't think that's what you're talking about in terms of consideration, though that may be a piece of it. That seems like it's probably fairly well handled. Are you talking about supply for rural developments or clusters of rural development? Well, maybe it would help me to understand if you could just give an example, like a real world example of where water supply issues have been considered and, locate us.
Yeah, I think I think that when you look at the kind of access and water supply conversation, it doesn't have any boundaries necessarily. Kind of you go back to the code is the code. If it's municipal and you have hydrants and a lot of water volume available, obviously that's kind of the highest level of fire protection as far as delivering water to a structural fire of residential commercial type. But when you get into those rural communities, you have to adapt to the situation. Where I grew up on 15 acres in the middle of nowhere, California, we did not have hydrants. And so how is the fire department going to be successful, or how does your residents, how is it going to be successful in the event of a fire? And there's all sorts of opportunities out there from to create those alternate methods, as we like to call them in the code, whether it be that automatic sprinkler system in the house to where, hey, you can't get hydrants to this new, development that you have, if it's just a few homes, but there might be an opportunity to do automatic sprinklers in these residences. Or, there's portable tanks that they can install on their property that may give the opportunity, again, for the fire department to plumb into a substantial amount of water, 500 or 1,000 gallons if someone's on a well. So there are opportunities out there to truly be creative to meet the intent to access and water supply. And that fire official always has the ability to be flexible and deliver on the needs of the community or whatnot. But it's much easier, to your point, Sadie, to go into a municipal development that already has, some infrastructure put in, and then just teeing off from there and having that real robust water supply ability. But there are options. We have code references. NFPA 1122 talks about rural water supply, rural access and water supply, and that's referenced in our code, so we can use that as a guide as well. So there's lots of opportunities to make folks successful out there.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Glad you're here, Chad. This is really helpful because there is that overlap between like you're saying, at the, at the development application versus when a building is built. Yeah. And so that's really important to understand. All right. It doesn't look like there are any more questions. And Kurt made a really good point about fire sprinkler systems. I'm just going to add something too that, I've been reading about. I mean, there are places, and this is something that, is not necessarily being contemplated that I know of in Oregon, but where folks have external sprinkler systems on their homes. Maybe that's not necessarily something that is being required, but, an option that folks can consider. All right.
All right. So we're ready for the breakout rooms? Susan?
Yep.
All right. The overview of the breakout rooms, you will be transported into a room with a facilitator. We will also record those conversations so we can use them to get our meeting summaries together. We thought it'd be a good opportunity for all of us to introduce ourselves again in a smaller group. It's been a while since we have done a round of introductions for everybody involved. And then we will take a look at some of the ideas for how communities can plan. So we're planning to be in the breakout room for 25 minutes. Susan, anything you'd like to add? All right, and the big picture question is, how could communities plan with fire departments to ensure integration of design features? And with that, Trish, do you want to take us to our breakout rooms?
Sure thing.
Thank you.
Hi, Josh. Were you in a room previously?
Don't believe so. What was the breakout rooms?
Okay, I'm just making sure you just joined and you weren't in a room and dropped off. So I will
Oh,
put
no.
you in a room.
Thank you.
All right, welcome back, everyone, to the big room. I wanted to check on time. We have a few minutes. We're getting ready for a break, but I wondered if there was a couple of things people wanted to share from their rooms on this discussion. So for the facilitator, I could start as an example. We had a very good discussion about the differences between pre and post occupancy. So buildings that are not yet built and lived in, and the ones that are currently in existence. So for how to plan, Rubiel said, you know, he has to work with his neighbors to come up with a plan. You know, how do you kind of instigate that coordination? And we talked about ways that maybe transportation streets could be expanded so it's multiple use. Rubio was talking about, so bike lanes and pedestrian lanes that are wide enough for cars, but then in an emergency, then they would have that capability. Making sure, again, on the statewide level, making sure that agencies are coordinating together. So, you know, a lot of rules are important for life, quality of life, and making sure that rules and programs, life safety isn't lost. And there was more, you'll see it in the notes, but it was a very engaging conversation, and I'd turn it over to another group if there's a summary.
Sure, I'll jump in. I'll lower my hand. So we also had a really interesting conversation. It was completely different than yours, so that's interesting. Yeah. You know, we did talk. Kind of, we went a little bigger picture, which I think was helpful. But some of the high points are thinking about, well, certainly that emergency evacuation and response, you know, are two different needs for the transportation infrastructure, and sometimes there are conflicts there, which is very true. And we also talked about, when we were looking at some of these like more detailed standards, like would it make sense to look at like the model from Ashland where they're looking at evacuation zones, and is like that evacuation zone or a part of a community like the best kind of scale to look at some of these types of standards and planning a little more locally than say for a broad community. We talked about, you know, and that what's appropriate in one place might not be appropriate in another, you know, really localized solutions. We talked about multiple access points, and while seeing the benefit for new development from a firefighting and evacuation side, also concerned that for some, you know, rural residential areas, and, you know, up in the Mackenzie where they're trying to redevelop, requiring multiple access points could inhibit development. And so there's that kind of also a scale discussion there, I think, like within intensity and density of development and what might trigger something like that. We also did talk a little bit about like alternate routes. So in some of the evacuation, you know, folks were using hiking or walking access to get back into a property when they were evacuated to make sure like their generator was running, wasn't necessarily evacuation, but that there were trails that could be used. And we talked about trying to do more broad coordination and planning in advance with federal property owners, Forest Service, BLM, state and private property owners to you know, better map and some of these alternate routes, and you know, work on access agreements with landowners and have that in a plan that's, you know, developed by a wide variety of people, but really doing that in advance would be very helpful. And the last kind of thing that we talked about was, you know, there are areas where firefighters went in around the bootleg fire, and while there were multiple access points for them to get in, the roads were very poorly maintained. They were washed out. The firefighting apparatus, they couldn't get into those areas. So really having, rather than maybe requiring additional access for those areas where there's there's already access, are there potentially programs for education and funding for improvement and maintenance of the existing transportation network, which would involve, federal and county and state agencies. So it was a really great conversation.
Thanks, Susan. And Sadie?
Thanks, Libby. Well, a lot of the things that you all have mentioned came up in our conversation as well. I think we're all hearing loud and clear the need for coordination between our various state agencies in terms of how do our existing systems work together today so that we can better understand the gaps. Huge shout out to our fellow state agency colleagues and Chad, especially for being here today and answering some of these questions, stimulating some of these ideas. Because it's true, state agencies we have our authority and better coordination between where there is overlap in these spaces could help us understand the gaps and kind of best next steps. Kelly was in our breakout room. He puts a great point in the chat that folks can read, and it's really about increasing clear and objective standards for local development in regard to wildfire protection that can help put us in our communities in a safer place. We talked about the need for better GIS data for route identification, driveway locations, and we talked too about wildfires, fires in rural areas, rural residential developments, and is that an urban fire or a rural fire? And how should we or could we think about rural residential development that happens kind of in a piecemeal fashion and doesn't trigger kind of the same local planning review that a full-scale development of a subdivision might require. And so I think those are some good thoughts, particularly as we think about the way that we intersect with building codes and the state fire marshal, ODF, OEM, et cetera. So really appreciated the conversation. It was great to, I think I really liked the small group.
That's great. It's 10:35, so we're right on schedule. Well, it's 10:36 for a 10-minute break. So if we can shut down our cameras and come back here in 10 minutes. It'll be 10:45. Thank you very much.
Libby, maybe we should just ask for like a thumbs up from all these dark screens if they're sitting at the computer.
I was just gonna say, welcome
All
back,
right.
everybody. Yeah.
They're here.
Tammy, you can go to the next slide.
Libby, I feel like you are sitting in a bird sanctuary. There's just such lovely sounds coming through whenever
I
your
know.
mic is turned on.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah, I probably should close my door, but it sounds so nice. I can't do that. But
I closed my window because you could hear all my children screaming outside because we're still on COVID lockdown in our house and nobody's allowed at school.
yeah. Well, this is your section. Turning it over to you. Development considerations, Sadie.
Thank
Take it
you.
away.
Thank you very much, Libby. So I have the enviable task today of taking on a conversation about development considerations. So when we had our community listening sessions, really the strongest elements we heard were, number one, that equity piece that we kind of led off our conversation with today. Two, evacuation concerns, and three, development considerations. And then there was a lot of also concern about things that really aren't in necessarily our charge to develop, but when are we going to have defensible space standards in place? You know, how am I going to find out about them? How am I going to tell my neighbor about them? And that's sort of in a separate part of our recommendations, but development considerations are something that DLCD is specifically asked to consider. So our next slide talks about what we heard in our community listening sessions. So these are, you know, when we looked back at all of the notes of our conversations from people all around the state, we heard these things and some others. They are captured in the notes. If you have others you want to add to this list, please put them in the chat. But create easy to understand statewide standards that can help with accessibility and response. So again, maybe a little bit of conflict there with allowing for regional differences. Consider local jurisdiction expertise needed to review land use requirements. So, you know, to Kelly's earlier point, what kind of clear and objective standards should we have clear and objective standards at a statewide level that would relieve local governments of some of the burdens of consideration or some of the need for review? Is there an opportunity there? Conflicting development considerations. So I think for me, this falls in a couple of different ideas that I've heard, but just to expose it for folks. House Bill 2001 requires additional density or requires local governments to allow for additional density on lots that are zoned for single family development. So if we are allowing for the development of an additional structure, an accessory dwelling unit, you know, a townhome, some kind of apartment dwelling situation, are we creating levels of density that are in conflict to reducing the density that we want to see? You know, I can think of probably places within the ODF map where the addition of an ADU on someone's property could expand the WUI into an area, and that really changes things for both that property and for their neighbors and for our planning. But also, you know, within conflicting development considerations, I kind of think also about conflicting use considerations. And this came up in our community listening sessions, but also in our conversations here with this group. So when I think of conflicting use, you know, we right now, I think probably a lot of us on this call have enjoyed special events at wineries or at farm stand locations, you know, pumpkin patches, things like that. So there are uses that are allowed in a rural context that might have limited evacuation opportunities, Should there be considerations that we are making to better protect people in those scenarios? So should they have to have, an adequate water supply or something like that? Should there be safety considerations that we're taking into account? Lack of infrastructure to fight the size and the type of the fire. So we heard about this earlier today from Chad. We saw it, I think, in, was it the city of Talent or Phoenix that ran out of water to fight and defend themselves against an urban conflagration. So how do we ensure that cities have the right infrastructure? So that's water access, but also road access. And Laura talked about some of those considerations within our transportation planning rule today, earlier in this conversation. So impact, will this impact, should our considerations of wildfire risk impact where we can have future development? Should we be thinking about placing people in harm's way? Should we have additional standards if people do make the choice? Should we be thinking about where and how we place things that we might consider critical facilities, a hospital, a school? If we do place them there, should there be additional safety standards that they put in place? A concern that we heard was that the cost of infrastructure. So if we increase the cost of development for home, for multifamily residential, if we increase the transportation costs because we are requiring alternate egress, we are requiring additional water supply, is that going to burden our housing crisis? Are we going to have even more difficulty finding adequate housing for everyone? And finally, we heard that a local public process is really one of the best tools that we can use in determining how to protect our communities. So those are the considerations, and then we can move to the next slide, which is some solutions. So again, these are taken from our notes from these statewide community listening sessions. There were 4 of them. Should we create, or should there be a model code? So that's a model development code, a zoning code. Should there be a model code? And that's something that a local government would put into place, model code and guidance that would require mitigation measures against wildfire. Could there be a baseline state code similar to the way that we are treating defensible space in Senate Bill 762? Should we have a baseline code for safe development, and then allow local or regional application to be more stringent? This is very much in keeping with the way land use works today. So we have kind of a state minimum, but local governments are allowed to be more stringent, more specific. They just can't be less specific. Should we add wildfire as a zoned risk map in local communities, in counties and cities, the way that we address flood and landslide? So right now, those are mapped areas that we say, yes, we're going to map them here, and maybe there's additional development considerations that we take into consideration when we are building or permitting use within those areas. And then similar, should we be thinking about places where multiple hazards come into play? So one thing we know about wildfire is that it increases the likelihood of landslide and flooding. So when an area is completely denuded by wildfire, there's a lot more debris flow. We've seen this in California, shutting down different highways, sort of like landlocking communities in some circumstances, but also the increased likelihood of flood for similar reasons. So should we be thinking about the interplay of multiple hazards and the impact that or the considerations that we should be taking when we are thinking about new or permitted development? And then another possible solution is, can we look at studies that have taken place in, scientific best practices types situations that help us understand and potentially incorporate the minimum or ideal spacing of structures based on fire behavior to improve chances of structure survival. And again, I think this is a place where that state agency coordination could be a real benefit to the overall thinking and product at the end. Okay, next slide. I promise, is this our last solution slide? Yeah, okay. So creating a standard methodology for recommending fire resistant landscaping plants within our different hazard ignition zones. So could we go to our local nursery and just have a special tag that hangs on those plants that are appropriate? Maybe offer some education to folks that are working in those contexts that could help homeowners create more fire resistant, resilient spaces. This is a really interesting bullet, I think, and that is when we are considering wildfire hazards. So, we heard in our small group, we've heard throughout this process, we don't know what that looks like because we don't have any visibility on what the wildfire risk map is going to look like. But when we see these hazardous areas, how might we allow or ask or require cities to think about what is planned for development in areas that are extreme or high risk? Should they have an opportunity to rethink where housing is placed, how housing is placed, how much housing is placed based on those considerations? And this is a pretty technical bullet, so if you have questions, please raise your hand and let me know, and I'll try to clarify, or I'll get somebody who's smarter than me to clarify. Are there certain types of development, and we talked about this a little bit on the previous slide, that we should think about limiting or restricting in these extreme and high risk areas? So we talked about critical facilities, schools, hospitals, maybe your fire station, your local emergency, EMS, your 911 center, but also, are these places where we would want to think about development of multifamily residential? Are there other types of development we would want to consider differently based on wildfire risk? And then the need, and I think I talked about this on the previous slide, and we've talked about it earlier in the conversation today, the need to look at infrastructure resiliency to wildfire. So both in terms of what we need in the event of a wildfire, also what we need to recover from a wildfire. And these, again, are somewhat disconnected systems within state government, but a recommendation of this group could be to bring these into closer coordination. So we don't permit septic tanks, for example, but we know that's a barrier to recovery, is replacing aging septic tanks. Is there something we need to look at there? Is that a recommendation that we would have? Okay, next slide. Okay, so new building, redevelopment, and permitted uses. So these are all falling under the umbrella of development considerations. So what are the best practices to reduce building to building fires? Are those things that we should be looking at, incorporating, developing code around, coordinating with our state agencies to identify? Are there things we need to think about in terms of where or how we locate a house or development? Really, I'm thinking mostly about dwellings, where people sleep, where people eat, on a site. The top of a steep slope has a higher likelihood of igniting than other more fire safe locations within a piece of property or parcel. Do we want to think about clustering of houses in open space? Clustering of houses with open space in higher risk areas. So do we want to have fire breaks or buffer requirements that will protect the homes within these rural or even urban clusters? And how might we incorporate that? Do we want to do that? Do we want it to be all homeowners' discretion, or do we want this to be a community-led process? Access to water supply and other public facilities. We've talked about limiting types of development based on risk zones, also permitted uses, or kind of rethinking development or permitted uses might be another way to think about it. So if we are allowing development to take place, should there be rigorous standards in areas that are, or more rigorous standards in areas that are at extreme or high risk? And then we have potential conflicts and opportunities in land development and development review processes. And then maintaining protection of resource lands in risk areas by reducing parcelization, maybe having an open space tax credit or a transfer of development rights program. So that's a lot of ideas packed into those last two bullets. I'm just going to take the last one first. So reducing parcelization, we heard about this from a planner in our breakout room. The chat bubble keeps coming up in front of my words here. I'm sorry, I'm not paying attention to the chat. I hope others are. But parcelization is can happen in a number of ways, and it sometimes can increase the proliferation of rural residential development in areas that would be the WUI. They could be high or extreme risk. There are ways that we could reduce ability to cut up land into smaller developable lots. But that might not be what we do want to do. I mean, there are costs and benefits to everything. Open space tax credit is where somebody might agree not to build in an area that was suitable for development and get a tax credit for it. Similar to the way that keeping agricultural land in productive use gets you a farm credit or an agricultural credit. We could have an open space tax credit to encourage people not to develop on land that was suitable or permitted for development. And then finally, a transfer of development rights program. And I hope I'm kind of tracking for everybody here. That would be, and we have kind of a not very robust system in place in our state today. It's a pretty technocratic, so I won't go into the details, but a transfer of development rights would be a scenario in which somebody with, for example, a rural residential lot in a high or extreme risk area might be able to sell their development rights for profit and move that development to a place that was more appropriate. And that would require probably, a state marketplace to be developed and a system in place for that transfer to happen. But that's a way of compensating. Both the tax credit and the TDR program are a way of compensating landowners for not developing in areas that would put the development or the neighboring development at increased risk.
So Sadie, I just wanted to take one little break because there's a conversation going on in the chat that is related to what you're talking about, and
great,
a number of people are going back and forth on it, but kind of if you wanted to take a quick look at it, but it's the kind of the idea between what you had already talked about, which is the trade-off between having, I think we've talked about it before, like in the community meetings, it was, how do you mitigate the risk of where you put homes compared to the risk of fire? So that I just wanted to make sure that you saw the back and forth there. And I think the
Definitely.
breakout rooms will be a great place to have an in-depth discussion about these.
Yeah, it's
trade-offs.
a pretty long thread, so I don't
Yeah.
know if I should take the time to.
No,
read
not the
it.
take, I just wanted to make sure
Yeah.
that you were aware of it, that's all.
Yeah. If folks do have a question and just want to raise hands that would sort of help facilitate the conversation moving forward with the group, that's great. Or we could wait for the breakout rooms.
Breakout rooms, yeah,
Okay.
good.
So then this is ideas germane to new building, redevelopment, and permitted uses. And then we have our next slide, which is recovery specific development. So should there be increased standards for rebuilding in areas that are or have been subject to wildfire? Should that be related to the risk map or the WUI? We do have existing standards for rebuilding that are specific to floodplain areas in the state that say, hey, your house washed away the first time or was significantly damaged in a flood and needs to be replaced. And now, if you need to rebuild, you're going to need to rebuild this much higher or using these building standards. The citing of and standards for sheltering and interim housing for residents displaced by wildfire. So John Jennings, thank you for being on the call, mentioned the alternate egress opportunities without a goal exception in talking about the recovery sheltering that we did after the 2020 wildfires at DLCD. So those are some considerations that we could have in terms of making recovery opportunities for our community members safe. How can we help local governments in recovery? So DLCD helped local planning offices move permits through in different recovery scenarios after the 2020 fires, because as people wanted to rebuild, there was really just a crush of applications on local planning offices that are already understaffed, already under stress in a recovery scenario, maybe dealing with their own recovery related issues for themselves or their family. And then they have this crush of permits coming in from other folks that are trying to deal with the same issues. So, can DLCD have a permanent program in place or a flexible planner that would allow us to focus on assisting local governments in recovery scenarios? And then should we think about a buyout program? So that's similar to the transfer of development rights. So if somebody has a home that was consumed by wildfire, and we do this in floodplains, FEMA does this, should the state be developing a program that compensates them if they say, you know what, I don't want to rebuild here? Can we compensate them for those development rights? Can we buy that property and give them the opportunity to move someplace that is within their comfort zone? And Susan, if you have anything you want to add on this, I know you've worked really closely in the recovery specific stuff. So if I missed something, please chime in. Otherwise we can go.
The next step is to go back into the breakout rooms. I thought that was nice, smaller space for discussions. And the idea here is, again, the big picture is how can cities and counties plan for development and appropriate use? What are some potential development considerations? And what types of changes to city or county development review processes could help? And we are going to go back into the same rooms we were in before. Is that right, Tricia?
That's correct.
And so we'll see everybody there shortly.
Katie, were you previously assigned to a room or are you just now joining for the first
Just
time?
now joining.
Okay, let me see which room I should get you into. Okay.
We still here?
Oh, we're back. We were still talking. I thought we had a little more time.
Yeah.
Oh, we got cheated.
Oh,
Yeah.
You cheated us. Susan Millhauser, you cheated
It
us.
wasn't me, it's Trisha.
I'm sending you back. Mike, do you remember what room you were in?
I was in room one.
Okay, we are about to close in a minute and a half. Do you want me to push you over there?
No, just if I can, I'll just hang out here until folks come back.
Perfect. Sounds great.
Just to add really quickly, but yeah, it makes it consistent to where you can show a column BCD, a column, well, not BCD, let's say the Oregon Residential Specialty Code, the Fire Code, land use, and planning, and it basically, shows the authorities and scope of each one of those components on a manufactured home, on a 1-2 family dwelling, on a commercial occupancy, or whatever it's going to be. You could actually do a crosswalk to see where there's overlap. And then also just, again, set the sideboards for what the scope and authority is before you start looking at other global, changes that could be considerations.
Okay. And could you, because we were kind of in transition, where is that located?
It's not located anywhere.
Oh, you just do it.
Have a new
It's
code section.
integrating all the plans and codes as far as comparison and crosswalking where there could be some need to.
Okay, got it.
As a new code provision comes up, we kind of work with BCD, whether it's a technical advisory or whether it's a joint policy bulletin. We look at how the fire code and the building code overlap, and then we send it out to both of our respective fire service members and building code officials so that each one of them know how to enforce it and how they're looking at it through their individual lenses and where maybe the overlap or lack thereof may be.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We have 13 minutes, so Susan, I think, what if we go to the next steps? Or do you want to take a few minutes? Should we take a few minutes to recap our rooms? We could probably do 2 minutes each.
Yeah, next steps will be like a minute.
Okay, all right, then we have plenty. We have a couple of minutes then. So who wants to go first? You ready, Sadie?
I can.
Okay,
Yeah. Excuse me. Really great conversation. I think we could have spent half a day in that breakout room. I didn't even get to my recovery development slide. So I apologize to my group for not getting us that far in the conversations. But I think, there's a lot, what we heard in our group is there's a lot already being done through Senate Bill 762. But that, in view of that, we do think, or the group thought, that local development of something like a community wildfire protection plan and local standards should still have import and bearing on how we ultimately protect our communities from wildfire. And so the idea of allowing for some local authority was something that came up for us. And then again, gaps that exist both within how our state agency programs intersect, but also places where we might have gaps that leave our communities unprotected. And so one thing that came up, and it's come up here before, it came up in the ODF RAC and in other conversations, was the gap that exists for building hardened standards for manufactured housing. And for commercial development, strip mall development. If we have a community of hardened homes right across the street from a completely unprotected strip mall, what kind of a risk situation are we creating for that community? So some definite potential for finding solutions, I think, as we look forward to how and where development is affected by the way 762 is implemented today, and where we might find improvements for our communities.
Susan, are you ready?
Sure. We also did not get to the recovery specific development, though we did it a little bit in our conversation about the development considerations. I think we had some conversations more broadly about areas, how wildfire hazard might come into play with looking at how an urban growth boundary might be expanded to address wildfire hazards. Mary Kyle brought up a really good point that research has shown that Oregon's land use planning program, while not intentionally set up to do this, but has resulted in fewer losses to structures and people than in other places like California by nature of having urban growth boundaries and compact urban development surrounded by farm and forest and other resource lands and more rural scale development. We talked a little bit about a little bit of the disconnect with the timing, where we really don't know how our programs with the building codes and defensible space, how those are going to be working to better protect our communities, while we're also starting to talk about land use and where and what types of land use may be allowed in certain places and not in other places. So there's a little disconnect there, but also we are charged with looking at land use, so I think our recommendations are pretty broad. We had an opportunity. Kyle was in our group and he joined us a little late today, but just talking about how a lot of the development considerations that we've been talking about really were put into practice with the West Side Transect Zone and getting a little more information about that project, which is actually outside of an urban growth boundary. It's a more a rural development density at 2.5 acres per home, and that type of density and the price points for those homes aren't necessarily specifically meeting like the housing need in the region. I mean, it's a niche and not more broadly meeting housing needs at a variety of price points. And I think we also talked a little bit about special events and mass gatherings. And yeah, I'm trying to think what else. I will stop there.
That's a good list. So our group, I think we get extra bonus points because we did look at both the new building redevelopment and permitted and recovering from specific development, but mostly because our discussion centered on thinking about development as the level of risk versus the level of mitigation that would be required to allow development to occur in certain areas. And one of the concepts that came up was that we land use code and fire departments are kind of looking at risks like the earthquake risks and tsunami risks, and that kind of integrating responses to those is not, this is a new emerging risk that needs to be developed to the same level that we are doing with earthquakes and tsunamis. There was some, I asked the group what was their, like the best recommendation they had around development, and things we heard was incentivizing around the built environment, access and regress, and best management, as well as we heard this a lot in our community briefings. I don't think community listening sessions, this idea about relationships, like that human infrastructure is going to be so important, that people, different departments are talking together, that communities are listening to each other. That came up too is, knowing your demographics of the area that you're working in, what languages people speak, and being, on the equity side, making sure you understand who's at the table and who you're listening to. So that's my summary. If we, all right, I think we can move on to next steps. Oh, I did see there's a, Trish, could you read the chat? Every time we change screens, I lose there it goes. From Kelly. Kelly, do you want to, I like your suggestion. Do you want to voice that?
Sure. And I'll be fast. I mean,
Yeah, that's right.
I just think it would be nice to have, and I understand they need to go back to their boards or their directors or their group. I have the benefit that I don't have to do that, but yeah, some of the special interest groups, especially the ones that are more on the side of kind of protecting developer interests. I would like to see some suggestions for our August meeting from those groups, if they can get some put together that their board approves, because I'd be really interested in seeing the suggestions they have, because I do a lot of code writing and a lot of editing of big documents. It's much easier to edit and to kind of refute things that other people are bringing up than to kind of come up with the ideas yourself. So, I mean, I think it'd be great if they had ideas that they could bring to the table as well, that hopefully could get supported at the state legislature. But I'd be interested to hear and see those ideas.
Okay, thank you. I did also want to say that Susan and Sadie, I forgot to say it in my group, but we did want to offer one-on-one meetings with everybody who's on this group, if you're interested in that. If there's things, ideas, thoughts that you want to share that you've been thinking about, and it's not exactly, we're covering too much stuff in one meeting and we didn't have time for it. So if you want to email Susan and let her know about that we can get those scheduled. So you could either email Susan, or you could put your name in the chat and say you would be interested in a one-on-one, kind of like a stakeholder interview, on offer for everybody on this call. So, and Susan.
Yeah, I think I'll just say, I think this could have huge benefit to us as we get kind of closer to the finish line, to have, a half-hour opportunity at your convenience to really sort of do a deep dive in the areas that are specific to your interest or lived experience. I know it's a big group. It's been hard to hear from everybody, but we know that there is a lot of lived experience within the folks here today. And so we would love to capture that, especially if we have missed something in our conversations that is relevant to your experience or your knowledge base or your constituency, etc. And I see Samantha has her hand up.
I was just going to add, it's hard to come up with solutions when we don't have the materials in advance. And I know we're all in a bunch of work groups, many of us all together, and there's a lot of work going on right now. So it's hard to carve out that time. But it seems like through the community listening sessions and through this, there's maybe already some very high level draft concepts that maybe if at the next meeting is really like the meeting to, weigh in on ideas, that if we could have those in advance, so those of us that do have internal process can go and get those positions. Otherwise, like, it's just like, I can't say I, support something or don't if I have to do it in the meeting. It's just not, I can't do that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Samantha. And just for the benefit of all on the call, between now and Susan will talk about this in our next steps, which we only have a minute to do. So Susan, go to next steps and tell them about when they're going to be able to read our draft report with recommendations.
Yeah, next slide, please. And thanks for bringing that up, Samantha, because it's hard to think about what's missing or how you might approach something differently if you don't have a sense of what's potentially being proposed. So as you can see on this slide, we are currently working on a draft, very drafty with a lot of holes, recommendation report for the Land Conservation and Development Commission. And so we are checking in with them at their July meeting. So that's July 22nd, and I will make sure to email that information to the group. But at that meeting, we will be giving them an update on our engagement process to date, which, as you all know, will wrap up in August after the commission meeting, and then next steps, but really our high level recommendations, and where we also frankly will identify we need to have more conversation on this. We need to meet with our stakeholder group again, and as well as during July, we'll be checking back in with our agency partners. So Chad and Alana, stay tuned, as well as folks at Oregon Emergency Management or Office of Emergency Management and some other agency folks that we've touched base with, as well as tribes. We have a meeting set up again for everybody wants to see, what we have to say. So we'll have that feedback opportunity. And then after that, we will be working on the final recommendations report, which will be due to the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council and the Legislature, October 1. I'll also note that I believe, and I haven't seen the final agenda yet, we will be providing an update to the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council at their meeting on July 8th, but that is still being, that agenda is still being refined. So, and Sam, to answer your question, yes, so we will have that draft recommendations report as well that we can share with this group, and then any feedback that we receive from the commission. So the timeline is a little tight. Their meeting is July 22nd, and then our next stakeholder group meeting is August 16th. So we'll have a little time to get that summarized and get that to you all as well in advance of the August meeting. And then again, to reiterate quickly what Sadie said at the top of the meeting, but these are recommendations that will go to the legislature along with the council's recommendations that they'll be considering our work in October and amending their report to the legislature in the winter, and that will all go into conversations during the legislative session next spring. And then out of that, we will have more direction around policy option packages, which are funding, as well as legislative direction about what DLCD might be addressing in future rulemaking. And you can see there are multiple check-in points along the way, dates to be determined with the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council, and I don't have all their meetings on here, as well as our commission. So if we are going into rulemaking, there certainly will be a ramp up period with the commission and really looking at the community engagement and stakeholder engagement piece. And I will just note really quickly that we've had a lot of conversations internally that this group has really stepped up and you know, you're invested in this topic. And so we're just thinking like, well, if we do have a rules advisory committee, we hope that we can, you know, tap into this shared knowledge and expertise and kind of move these conversations forward to that more detailed level. I think next slide, please. All right. I think that's it. Again, thank you all for your time today. I really appreciated and enjoyed the small group breakouts. Hopefully that worked well for folks to have, you know, more focused conversations and to hear some different points of view. And it's all very helpful. And we thank you all for your time and feedback.